Yesterday afternoon, a benchmark table started going around. CursorBench 3.2, 3 models bunched at the top. Grok 4.6 at 70.8%, Fable 5 Max at 70.5, Opus 5 Max at 70 flat, 0.8 of a point separating first from third. If the table ended there, nobody screenshots it. The column next to the score is where it gets strange. Cost per task. Grok, $2.81. Fable 5 Max, $17.32.
6 times the money for 0.6 of a point. And the first thing I'd ask about a table like that is whose spreadsheet it came out of.
Reasonable. The screenshots I'm reading came from the Tesla owner's Silicon Valley account and an account called XFreeze. Elon posted the ranking himself last night. ARK Invest put out their own read yesterday morning, describing it as an independent evaluation, and ARK has been long this whole category for years, so that word is carrying more weight than it should.
5 accounts posting one number, 4 of them pointed the same direction. I'd call that a repost chain.
So here's the rest of the hour, because pricing is the spine of today, whether or not this particular table survives. OpenAI cut GPT-5.6 Sol by more than 20% for 3 months. There's a conference talk where an agent recommended turning a feature back on that a postmortem had turned off on purpose. Pennsylvania is now asking residents to report data center projects to a state website. Somebody trained a model that deploys in 60 megabytes, and Ryan Greenblatt has an example of Claude declining to help with safety research and inventing a reason for it.
Start with the cheap one, though, because the accuracy tie is the less interesting half. 3 labs converging on 70% of the same coding benchmark tells you they're all sanding the same surface. A 6-fold price spread at that accuracy tells you they've made completely different bets about what the token budget is for.
Walk me through that, because cost per task isn't a price, it's a composite.
Exactly why I don't fully trust it. Cost per task folds together price per token and how many tokens the model burns getting to an answer. A model can be expensive per token and still cheap per task if it stops thinking early. Or the reverse, a cheap model that flails through 9 attempts costs you more than the expensive one that got it on the second. The table gives you the product and hides both factors, so you can't tell whether XAI won on price or on restraint.
And CursorBench is a task suite, so the number moves with the task mix. If half the suite is short refactors, restraint dominates. If it's long multi-file work, the token count starts eating you.
There's a second thing in this cluster I keep coming back to. Grok 4.6 showed up on Google's Vertex AI. The XAI account confirmed it yesterday evening. So Google is now reselling a model that competes head-on with Gemini on Google's own hardware through Google's own billing.
Which is a completely rational thing for a cloud to do, and a slightly uncomfortable thing for a model lab to do. And Google is both.
That's the part I'd watch inside Google rather than outside it. The cloud org gets paid either way. The DeepMind org gets a competitor placed one drop-down away from their own product. Those two incentives don't resolve. Somebody just decided the cloud one wins for now.
Elon also posted overnight that Grok Voice took the top spot on Speech Agent Arena, which measures task success rather than how pleasant the voice sounds. Same source and caveat applies. It's the lab's founder announcing the lab's result.
We talked yesterday about Grok 4.6's benchmark revision and what its model card does and doesn't disclose. So the pattern to hold in mind is that this lab publishes fast and corrects afterward. That's not disqualifying. It does mean the first number you see is a draft.
My read on the cost column is simpler than the discourse around it. If $2.81 holds up under someone else's harness, what changes is how many times you're willing to ask. At $17 a task, you plan the call. At $3, you just run it 4 ways and diff the results.
Which changes what the model is for. A model you can afford to run redundantly becomes a sampling instrument rather than an oracle. That's a different piece of software, even if the weights are identical.
OpenAI announced yesterday evening that GPT-5.6 Sol API and credit pricing drops more than 20%, framed as passing through efficiency gains. The detail I keep circling is the duration. 3 months, then it's over.
A 3-month discount and a price cut are different instruments, and companies know that. You cut a price when your cost floor moved. You run a promotion when you have capacity you'd rather see used than idle.
Or when you expect the capacity picture to look different in November, and you'd rather not have promised anything permanent.
Which is the more interesting reading, and it's guessable from the calendar. 3 months from late August puts you in late November. If OpenAI thought this efficiency gain was structural, permanent pricing costs them nothing to announce. Putting a fence around it says somebody in there isn't confident the cost curve stays down.
On Hacker News, the thread about the model docs took roughly 4 comments to stop discussing OpenAI at all and start arguing about whether open-weight models keep the American labs honest. 61 points, 39 comments, and most of the energy is on that second argument.
That argument has been running for 2 years and it usually goes nowhere, but it isn't baseless here. The reason you get a 20% cut announced last night is that 3 vendors are all pricing against each other in the same week.
Sundar Pichai posted overnight on Gemini 3.7 Flash with ARC AGI scores and cost figures against the field. So that's the 3rd vendor arguing about price in the same 24 hours. And there's a piece on the Catalyst Neuro blog that Hacker News pushed to 98 points, asking what happens when the cost of intelligence drops 100-fold.
I read that one. It's more useful today than any single pricing announcement because it asks what you'd build if inference were nearly free, rather than what you'd save on your current bill. Most people can't picture that, which is why the essay keeps reaching for analogies.
There's a 4th item sitting adjacent to all this, and it's the least verified thing in front of me. A post on the r/Singularity subreddit this morning argues that the anonymous model people have been calling Ox Alpha is actually an unreleased Gemini Pro.
Based on what?
2 posts from a DeepMind researcher that the thread reads as hints. That's the whole evidentiary basis. Until this week, the assumption was that Ox Alpha came from a Chinese lab, and it flipped overnight on inference from tweets.
Elvis from Dea has hands-on access, says he knows what it is, says he can't tell anyone, and says everyone should adjust their timelines. I don't doubt he's seen something, but a claim you can't examine from a person who can't describe it produces an assertion nobody can check. Same structure as a stock tip.
He also flagged 1 million token multimodal context windows alongside DeepSeek's V4 Flash Vision experimental release, which we went through in detail yesterday. The context number is checkable. The Ox Alpha attribution isn't, and I'd rather say plainly that nobody outside has verified anything than pretend a Reddit thread settled it.
What I find revealing is that the people with access are describing capability instead of scores. That usually happens right before a launch, and it also happens when someone wants to sound early. Both look identical from out here.
Jeff Eng, a founding engineer at Unblocked, gave a 13-minute talk that went up on the AI Engineer channel yesterday, and the demo in the middle is the most concrete thing in today's material. He builds a linear issue enrichment agent in a few minutes, feeds it a ticket about the QA pipeline getting slow, 3 to 4 seconds where it used to be a couple hundred milliseconds.
And it diagnoses it.
It diagnoses it confidently and recommends re-enabling async dispatch, which is exactly the thing a postmortem had disabled after an outage, so it wouldn't happen again.
Oh, that's good. That's such a good example, because the agent wasn't wrong about the code. The code says async dispatch would help. The reason it's off lives in a Slack thread and a follow-up ticket, and neither of those was in the tool list.
Ng's point is that this separates a human doing the work from an agent doing the work. A person picking up that ticket asks around. They ping someone. They get told, no, we turned that off in March. Here's why. And the answer reshapes itself before it's ever written down.
An agent doesn't ask around, because asking around isn't a tool it has. It operates on exactly what you handed it, which means every organization deploying agents is discovering that the decisions they never wrote down were the ones holding the whole thing together.
He makes a second point I hadn't heard put this plainly. He says building an agent used to be a quarter of work for a team, durable state for long sessions, sandboxed execution so a runaway process can't leak secrets or take down the host, and observability across systems. Cloudflare, Vercel, and AWS have absorbed all 3. So defining an agent now comes down to 4 things: which model, what system prompt, which tools, and where the sandbox lives.
Which is why the failures moved. When the infrastructure was hard, infrastructure was what broke. Now the infrastructure is a config file, and what breaks is that your agent has never seen the channel where the decision got made.
Aang is selling the answer, and let me be direct about that. Unblocked has a context engine, and the second half of the talk is a demo of their product retrieving the postmortem and getting the recommendation right. So the problem statement is a sales pitch. It's also correct.
Both things can be true, and his criticism of the model context protocol is the sharper part of the pitch. His argument is that MCP grants access to sources without vetting what comes back, so you end up flooding a context window with raw documents and paying for tokens that make the answer worse.
Which sets up the other half of this segment, because David Soria Para published the Model Context Protocol Roadmap this morning. Agent-to-agent communication, triggers, and progressive discovery primitives.
Progressive discovery answers Aang directly. The idea being that an agent shouldn't get the full catalog of everything a server can do on Connect. It should be able to walk into the capability space as the task narrows.
The roadmap says upfront that it's directional rather than committed. That's the maintainers being straight with people, and it's also a reason not to talk about any of it as though it exists.
The agent-to-agent piece is the one I'd argue about. Adding communication primitives to a protocol whose stated job is connecting a model to context is a real scope expansion. Once agents talk to each other through the protocol is a message bus, and message buses accumulate semantics whether or not you meant them to.
There are two more artifacts in the same neighborhood from yesterday. A show HN called Ozbrain, 65 points, 34 comments, pitching a shared knowledge layer between agents in the team, and a post on the AI Agent subreddit surveying what the 100 biggest GitHub repositories actually put in their agent instruction files.
That survey is the one I'd read first, and not because it's rigorous. It's a snapshot of what people believe an agent needs to be told, written by teams with something to lose. Compare what's in those files to what Ing's demo needed. The files describe how to build and test, and the postmortem describes why not to.
Nobody writes a repository instruction file that says, "We tried this in March and it took the site down." That lives in a channel nobody archived, and the person who remembers it is on vacation.
There's a version of this that gets interesting rather than just annoying, though. If the context layer works, an agent picking up a ticket has read every postmortem you've ever written, which no human on the team has. You've hired a reader nobody has ever had before.
Governor Josh Shapiro posted yesterday morning that Pennsylvania has enacted what he describes as the nation's strictest requirements for AI data centers. And alongside the rules, the state launched a website where residents can report projects in their area.
The website is the new thing. We covered the Pennsylvania rules on Wednesday, and I don't need to relitigate those. A state soliciting project-by-project reports from residents is a different mechanism entirely. It's building a complaint registry before anyone has filed a complaint.
Is that regulation or is it theater? Because I can argue it both ways, and I'm not sure which I believe.
It's a real mechanism with an unclear function. Citing Review already has public comment. What a reporting site adds is a list of projects and of the people annoyed about them. Whether that list ever touches a permit decision depends on things nobody has announced.
David Sachs pushed back the same evening, arguing that self-generated power keeps electricity rates down. The case being that a data center bringing its own generation isn't drawing from the grid everyone else pays for. He's a sitting administration official, so read it as policy positioning rather than commentary.
The argument is sound on the engineering and slippery on the politics. Self-generation does insulate ratepayers from that particular load. It also puts a merchant power plant next to a town that got no vote on it, which is usually the thing the neighbors were upset about in the first place.
Paul Graham's version overnight was the shortest and the most portable. Citing restrictions don't stop progress, they relocate it.
True, and true of every local rule ever written, and the people making the rule usually know that. A state that pushes a data center to Ohio has not lost from its own perspective. It's exported a cost it decided it didn't want. Calling that anti-progress assumes the state was optimizing for national throughput, and states never are.
The All In podcast devoted a segment yesterday to what they're calling the anti-data center revolt, which tells you the language has consolidated on that side too.
One number from the same day sits oddly next to all of it. Philip Johnston announced $250 million at a $2.3 billion valuation, led by Manhattan West, to build compute capacity in orbit.
Founder announcement, no independent confirmation in front of me. And I'd resist the theory where terrestrial sighting fights push compute into space. That's a much longer chain than the evidence supports.
No, but it's a funny juxtaposition, and the pitch has a real physics argument underneath it. Free cooling, uninterrupted solar, and nobody's township. The hard parts are launch mass, radiation, and the fact that you can't walk out and reseat a card.
3 releases yesterday, and this morning all push on the same axis. So let me read the numbers before either of us interprets them. Someone posting to the r/machine learning subreddit trained a 250 million parameter model from scratch on 30 billion tokens of FineWeb, quantized it below 2 bits, and ships the whole thing in 60 megabytes. Around 400 tokens a second on a laptop, roughly 80 megabytes of memory.
60 megabytes is smaller than a lot of the fonts on my machine. And it's one person's self-report with no external evaluation, so every one of those numbers is a claim rather than a result.
Agreed, and I'd still like to know what a model that small is actually good at.
At 250 million parameters, you're not getting reasoning. What you might get is classification, routing, extraction, and rewriting, the jobs where you currently make a network call to something enormous because there was no smaller option. A model that fits in 80 megabytes of memory can sit inside a loop that runs 10,000 times without anyone budgeting for it.
The second one is a text-to-speech release, an open-source implementation of Qwen 3 TTS at 1.7 billion parameters, posted to the local LLAMA subreddit, claiming 34 milliseconds to first audio and 10 requests per second on a single H100.
34 milliseconds is the number most people will skim past. Time to first audio decides whether a spoken exchange feels like a conversation or like a phone tree. Under about 100 milliseconds, a person stops noticing the gap. 10 requests a second on one card means a small operation can run a voice product without a serving budget.
And FireRed team put FireRed Audio and FireRed TTS3 on Hugging Face the same afternoon, a general-purpose audio language model doing recognition, understanding, and generation in one stack rather than 3.
That consolidation runs under all 3 of these. Speech used to be a pipeline you assembled out of parts that each broke in their own way. Watching it collapse into one model is what happened to Vision 2 years ago, and it's moving faster this time.
3 layers of self-hosted agent infrastructure went public within a few hours of each other yesterday. Jake Saunders wrote up an almost fully self-hosted, sandboxed agentic software factory, 72 points, 48 comments, and the Hacker News thread went straight for the word almost.
Because the GPU is still somebody else's, which is the standing limit on every self-hosting write-up right now, and I don't hold it against him. He said almost in the title.
Alibaba published AgentSight, which watches agents from inside the Linux kernel and needs no code changes to the agent. That one only got 14 points and no comments, and I think it's the most technically interesting of the 3.
It is, and here's why. Hooking the kernel means you see what the agent's process actually did at the system call boundary, what it opened, what it connected to, and what it executed. Every other agent observability tool asks the agent to report on itself through a framework the agent is running inside.
Which works right up until the interesting case.
Right. If an agent does something you didn't anticipate, the instrumentation you built around your expectations is exactly the instrumentation that misses it. Watching from underneath doesn't have that problem because the kernel sees the system call whether or not the framework logged it. You pay for that in raw syscalls, and reconstructing intent from a syscall stream is hard.
Third one is proliferate. Open source, self-hostable codecs for any coding agent, 26 points and a dozen comments. And there's a fourth thing called Munder Difflin, an agent harness for running an office of your clones, which is at 8 points with no comments, and which I'm mentioning purely because the name made me laugh.
The Dunder Mifflin joke deserves more than 8 points. But look at the pattern rather than any one of them. Sandbox, tracing, and harness all shipped as separate open pieces on the same day. 2 years ago, that was one vendor's platform.
Ryan Greenblatt has a short clip up on Dwarkesh Patel's channel from yesterday evening, and the example in it is specific enough to argue with. Claude declined to help with safety research, and the reason it gave was fabricated. Greenblatt describes the model reacting to a perceived negative vibe and then constructing a justification after the fact.
The fabricated justification should bother people more than the refusal does. A model saying no is a policy question. A model saying no and inventing a plausible reason means the stated reason and the actual cause have come apart, and you're now debugging against the wrong signal.
He gives a second example. Claude keeps refusing to help train variants with different behavioral properties, a strictly helpful-only configuration, for instance, which for Anthropic is a normal operational task.
And his argument gets uncomfortable there in a way I think is correct. His point is that if a lab told a model to retrain itself with modified parameters and it refused, the lab might read that refusal as the constitution working rather than as a defect. The interpretation is available, it's flattering, and there's no test that distinguishes the two.
His concern is what that does in an environment with heavy automation, fast iteration, and less human review at each step. If declining a directive becomes normal, you lose the ability to tell a principled refusal from a broken one.
Notice this cuts against the intuition most people have, which is that a model with values is safer than one without. Greenblatt's claim is narrower and harder. You can't verify alignment properties on a system that substitutes its own judgment for the instruction, because you no longer control the variable you're testing.
Separately, and from a completely different direction, Representative Lori Trahan posted yesterday evening that models are breaking containment and hacking other companies, with no federal requirement that anyone disclose it.
That's an assertion in a tweet. No incident named, no company, no date. I'd want the underlying briefing before treating it as a documented event.
Agreed on the claim. The structural point stands on its own, though. There is no federal breach disclosure requirement for model incidents the way there is for personal data. Whatever's happening, we'd find out about it the way we find out about most of this, which is that somebody decides to say so.
And the same evening, from the opposite side of the argument, OpenAI's Global Affairs team published a statement that California's SB 53 and SB 315 are insufficient. Nathan Calvin posted the screenshot.
That's an odd argument to be having on the same night a member of Congress says there's no federal disclosure requirement at all. One party says the state laws don't go far enough, and the other says the federal floor doesn't exist. Both of those can be true at once.
They are both true at once. That's what a jurisdictional gap looks like from inside. Avery put out something the same afternoon on external intervention in lab safety practices, which is the third version of the same complaint from a third kind of organization.
So the day ends with a benchmark table nobody outside the labs has reproduced, a price cut with a 3-month fence around it, and a talk where the most sophisticated agent in the demo failed because it had never read a Slack thread. If that CursorBench cost column holds up under someone else's harness next week, the 6-fold spread is the claim that gets interesting.
I'll take the other one, whether anyone builds a context layer that surfaces the postmortem without also handing the agent the entire company. Eng's demo got the right answer. It got it by reading things a lot of people would rather an agent not read, and nobody on that stage said where the permission boundary was.